Hello and welcome to the NDTV Dialogues, a conversation of ideas. As we're on the cusp of a new year, on this episode, we look at the aspirations and challenges for India in 2015. And I'm very happy to be joined by a distinguished panel for this debate. I'm joined by Nobel Laureate, Professor Amartya Sen. I'm also joined by N.K. Singh of the BJP, Professor Yogendra Yadav of the Aam Aadmi Party, Shekhar Gupta, and also joining me from Goa is Mr. Shaurya Doval, who's now heading the India Foundation. Thank you all very much for being part of this dialogue. Professor Amartya Sen, as we go into India in 2015, do you feel that your earlier words on the Prime Minister are being proved wrong? When you look at 2015, where do you see India and where do you see its governance?
Well, I don't know what earlier words about the Prime Minister you're talking about. When I was discussing the prospects of different parties, I made several statements, and some of them might prove wrong and some of them may prove right.
Or you won't be happy to see him as Prime Minister?
That I did say, because I did think that what I took to be a more secular party, there are many such, should be in that position. So are you asking me a question about whether my view on secularism and India has changed?
No, because I think we will go into that in detail, but more perhaps beginning on a note on looking ahead, as I said, to the challenges, the aspiration, and the governance issue.
I mean, if you write a book as I did with Jean Dwez, complaining about the continuity of hunger of the children, continuity of the fear of women in some parts of India, the absence of toilets in India, and then if you see them being stated by the Prime Minister from the top of the Lal Killa, one has every reason to be happy. After all, that is the kind of thing that I've been discussing for a long time. Was I delighted by it? Yes. The short answer is absolutely yes. That doesn't change the secularism issue, but these are very important issues in themselves.
Mr. N.K. Singh, when you come in on that aspect, looking ahead at 2015, looking at challenges of governance.
Well, I think that, frankly speaking, I'm also, let me say that glad that Amartya's assessment in some parts of Mr. Narendra Modi has proved to be wrong in terms of the agenda which he has undertaken of addressing issues which India definitely needs in order to improve its performance on the index of human development, in terms of education, in terms of health, in terms of cleanliness, in terms of toilets, in terms of change in attitude which will be conducive to health. And these are very important issues about which Amartya himself has written in great detail, that while growth is not the end objective of development, and that the nature and quality of development matters enormously. So I think that the Prime Minister's agenda on some of these issues is designed in 2015 to make and try and usher in a development agenda for India which emphasizes growth as much as it emphasizes the quality of growth in terms of what it does to very important indices on skills, in terms of the education, in terms of health qualities, change in practices in regard to cleanliness and toilets and so on. And that when you add all this and aggregate all this, it does definitely alter the strategy which has been followed so far. Regrettably, the strategy in the last 5 years have been one of the most disastrous strategies which India followed, in terms of a government which was paralyzed, and all that it did was drive entitlement schemes whose outcomes were exceedingly dubious.
Well, I'm glad you said word entitlements, because I want to bring Shekhar in, who at the time had coined for the UPA, and I don't know if it was a reference perhaps to our distinguished about how the UPA is being run by povertarian. Its thinking was povertarian and povertarian economics, and perhaps many have said that the biggest shift in this general election on the new government has been the change of thinking, a change of mindset. Do you agree with, do you see that as the most fundamental change, and do you think that's what's going to be carried forward, or do you see, as many have said, that look, what's actually changed?
Look, I'll try and simplify this this sort of conflicting definition as much as possible. This is not to say the poor do not need attention. This is not to say that the poor do not need the hand of the state. But this is only to say that what are the poor telling you now? The poor are telling you, you don't know what poverty means to me because you've never been there. So stop feeling sorry for me.
Professor Sen, of course, would dispute that in his work on the Bengal famine, etc.
I mean,
so are Professor Amartya Sen's economics still relevant? Is politics still relevant in today's India?
If I have an intellectual disagreement with Professor Sen, I'm honored.
Okay.
Right?
But that's true.
Yes. But if, I said if. So if,
was one.
maybe not. What I'm saying is the poor of India are saying, don't feel sorry for me. Because when you feel sorry for me thinking that I'm starving, and then you throw free food at me, I've got food. Right? I was just telling him the walk the talk for this week is not a walk the talk with celebrities. It was just some completely unknown tribals in a tribal village in Jharkhand. And you will find it begins with 2 young women going to school, class 10 women. And the first question to them is, Aapki kya samasya hai? What's your problem? This is a very poor tribal village in Jharkhand, deep Jharkhand. What are the 2 girls saying? Shauchalaya nahi hai. And they say it's embarrassing and it's unsafe to go in the dark every morning into the fields. We need toilets. They've got a cycle each. They're going to school. They are frankly quite well dressed. They are tribals in a poor village. They don't need free food. Maybe because they have free food, they have money to buy bicycles. But they want quality of life to get better. So poverty in India right now is that too many Indians are living suboptimally. Because state doesn't provide power, state doesn't provide water, state doesn't provide proper security, proper schooling, proper hospitals. Too many Indians live suboptimally. If we had a functioning state, the same people would live much better.
Is that the change in aspiration which Shekhar has talked about? Do you see that as well when we talk about Delhi, which is what the AAP is now focusing on in its next election? What is the biggest change you've seen and the biggest change post-elections? Because your threat now really is Mr. Modi. It's not really about competing ideologies. It's not really about it's about a personality.
Since we have a bigger canvas in this show, Sonia, I'll not speak only about Delhi.
Yes, of course.
And not about Mr. Modi alone. Let's speak about India and aspiration. And I've never understood one thing. The moment we talk of aspirations, somehow we focus on the economy. The moment we talk of aspiration, we start looking at from the vantage point of the so-called middle class, which is a euphemism in India for the top 20 percentile or so. And we focus too much on the instrumentalities for realizing aspirations. Let's keep our focus on aspiration. And when we think of aspiration, I think of political, democratic aspirations. People want governance to move closer to them. They want to be able to take control of their lives. There are economic aspirations, which includes freedom from hunger. Hunger is not yet, unfortunately, an issue which is behind us. It is a reality. There is aspiration for health. Unfortunately, in this country, the poor pay more for health than the rich do. Something needs to be changed drastically. And there is educational aspiration. Education now is such a deep aspiration, cutting across all classes. So we look at these aspirations. And finally, one thing that we don't talk about is cultural aspiration, dignified life, and ability to feel respect, to take pride in your own culture, tradition, where you come from. So these are the range of aspirations that we should be talking about.
Do we need to actually, when we redefine aspirations, so do we need to redefine our challenges as well? You pointed out that hunger is still, of course, a reality. Professor Amartya Sen's made that point. But are we looking at new challenges today? And I'm glad to welcome for the first time on the NDTV Dialogues, hopefully it won't be the last time, Mr. Shaurya Doval joins us of the India Foundation. And of course, the India Foundation has just organized a conference in Goa. And I think, Mr. Doval, one reason perhaps for the India Foundation's conference is to reclaim a space which you feel has been dominated too much by perhaps certain agendas. Do you think that it's really also about changing what agendas dominate our political debates, which are dominating the arguments or the dialogues we're currently having?
Both yes and no, because I think that what this conclave is really about, if you want me to talk about the conclave, but the conclave is really to project the Indian view on issues. and there has been an Indian view on issues, an Indian perspective on issues. All that we are now trying to do is trying to project it more visibly. So that's really what the conclave is about. But coming back to your earlier question, which was what the other panelists have been saying, I think people are making exactly, everybody seems to be agreeing that the aspirations are not unidimensional, they are multidimensional. There are economic aspirations. I think in 2015, India and Indians want to economically grow. Everybody wants to be economically upwardly mobile. So whether we take at the bottom where people are still struggling with hunger to our middle class and all the way up, people want an economic growth which is upwardly mobile, which invariably leads to what the Prime Minister has been talking about, which will have to be an employment-driven economic growth. People are indeed looking for, I think, in society, fairness. They're looking for justice. They're looking for things that, whether it's marginalized sections of society, whether it's the middle class, whether it's women, everybody wants a system in the country which is just and fair. People want security. People are seeing the environment around them, and people want the aspiration in 2015 will definitely be also about a safe and secure environment in which people can pursue both their economic and social aspirations. And then finally, I think the point about a responsive state. I think in 2015 we are going to see a much more aspiration from people across in our political structure about a political system which is more responsive to their needs. So I think it will be a multidimensional 2015 in terms of aspirations of Indians.
Just one quick point which you raised at the beginning of the answer when you said this is about an India perspective. Is it the perspective that you also saying is different from the idea of India, which is a term used very often, from the idea of India that we've seen often dominate discourse in the last decade?
Yeah, well, not just in the last decade. I think that there has been for thousands of years an Indian perspective on issues. In the last few years, there has been India has lost that intellectual leadership that it had for centuries, in being a place where the wise and the learned debated, discussed, and India provided intellectual leadership and solutions to many of the world's and humanity's problems. In the last few years, we become consumer of ideas and ideologies. And I think all that we are trying in our very humble way is to try and project and just trying to continue with that long tradition of reclaiming that space of global leadership and intellectual thought. And that's what really this conclave is about.
Professor Sen, that's interesting. Of course, in the argumentative Indian, you've touched on many of these points as well. But when we look at an Indian leadership, and I think that's been a lot what the government has also talked about the global policy and the very strong, robust leadership which seems to have emerged globally, do you feel that is perhaps a change or which will be very crucial for India in 2015, perhaps how India's looked?
I think I agree with the point that
Yes.
Mr. Doval was making, that there is a kind of an Indian perspective which has been historically important. It's not the various mythologies about one kind of hot button science of today being done 6 million years ago, 6,000 years ago. Not that.
Are we mixing up the two? Is there a danger that when we say Indian, that means it has to be a Vedic or somebody's version of it?
There's nothing wrong with Vedic, actually. I take,
No, I think it's how the term is being used.
But it's really, it's a question of whether we are looking at science, and I think, as Doval was saying, an intellectual aspect, as opposed to imaginary aspects. And if you look at the intellectual aspect, I think there's a lot to be proud of, and there's a long continuity. And I'll speak with a bit of a bias. I know that you were putting me in, you began by saying my political position. You have to bear in mind Sanskrit was my second language. So English was my third. It's not so much my Sanskrit was excellent, it was pretty good, but my English was awful. But one of the things to recognize that this tradition, and you mentioned kindly my book, Argumentative India, it's a very long tradition in India. It goes through, and it also goes through the Mughals and so on. But its beginning is very early. Now, Nalanda University, which we're trying to revive, and Kay and I both in the board of that, And one of the striking things is when Chinese students come. By the way, Nalanda is the only institute of higher education outside China to which any ancient Chinese ever went for higher education. But one of the things that Hiuen Tsang writes on arrival in 7th century, middle of 7th century, saying that one of the big differences in the method of education here is that while in China it's primarily lectures and listening, here it's much more argumentation. Everything is a debate. There's a thesis, there's a counter-thesis, there's an argument. So when I call my book Argumentative Indian, I don't think I should be accused of inventing something that didn't exist. It did exist.
Course.
And I think the point, as I understood Mr. Doval's point to be, that if there is an intellectual feature of India, of which we have reason to be proud, and I think our argumentative tradition is one of the things we have reason to be proud, to reassert it, to assert it more strongly, to make use of it in politics and economic debate. I mean, for example, when we were discussing, I agree that hunger is still the main big thing. Education is being sought, safety is being sought, mobility is being sought, but the absence of healthcare
Healthcare is being
is
sought.
probably the biggest difference in India. We ought to have argument on that. And what really worries me is when the media showed what I think in school context is called attention deficit syndrome, in not being able to stick to the point about how terrible the healthcare system in India is in terms of just out-of-pocket system primarily. And the absence of good public health care is probably the biggest issue from which people suffer.
Whether those issues actually come up at all. But Shekhar Gupta, I just wanted to bring you in because the aspect that Professor Amartya Sen touched on, and you just written recently also about this whole thing of forward-looking vision. And when we, Mr. Modi would perhaps do well, like Prime Minister Nehru, to base a bit more on a scientific vision and not get caught up sometimes by some of the statements made. We had recently an MP in Parliament talking about some mumbo jumbo and then saying, oh, but this is in Vedic times, or etc. So that does the message get blurred of Uttarakhand? Exactly, yes. So does that lines get blurred? When we talk about an Indian perspective, very interesting, because everybody on this table perhaps may have a different version of what an Indian perspective is.
Look, I think first of all, go back to the expression Vedic. I agree with Professor Sen. There's nothing wrong with the word Vedic. There is nothing wrong with the description Vedic.
Or with Sanskrit.
Yes, but what is wrong is passing off every mythology and every nonsensical belief of total intellectual, scientific, cultural and moral superiority over the whole world as something Vedic. Yeah. If the Vedic tradition was argumentative, all of India all of the world did not flock to India. The only Chinese scholars to go to foreign university did not come to India because they were given a doctorate. They came to India because they could argue with Indians.
Can I just
Sure.
supplement that? I mean, I totally agree with Shekhar. You see, I mean, we have different times. We have Vedic times, we have the Upanishadic times, we have the epic times, then we have the classical Sanskrit literature time, then we have the period of Islamic civilization also having its impact in India, and then, of course, Westernization, all that. But if you look at the Vedic time, now think of the song of creation in the Rig Vedas. What does it say? Now, this is a song, a evocation saying, who made this world? Was there someone who actually made it? And if somebody made it, does he remember he made it? And then the last line said, perhaps he does. And the absolute last line says, perhaps he does not. Gita, for example, there are two points of view, Arjuna and Krishna, and even though in a religious document you might think that only one wins, in the epic context, both perspectives are given great weight. Now, that tradition, we have every reason to be proud of, but peculiar things in science which we never did and which didn't exist.
Professor Yogendra Yadav, on that aspect, when you look at health and education, it's ironic that Nalanda University, reviving that tradition that today's universities are not even in the top 200 of the world. When you look at that mismatch of where our educational capabilities are, what the aspirations of students are, do you think that that's going to be one of the big challenges of 2015 that the new government, a new India, must address?
Indeed, and we must begin by thinking about schools in the first place. Look, let's admit, the entire RTE thing has collapsed.
Totally bogus.
It has.
Totally
I don't
bogus.
think it's
So
bogus.
enrollment levels are over 98%.
No, but you look, outcomes are zilch. Outcomes Yadav is right, outcome plummeting.
RTE was never meant to get you enrollment. Enrollment had happened by the time RTE came. It was about quality of education in the schools. And let's admit, I personally do not think RTE was bogus. I think there are some hastily designed provisions, as always in Indian laws, but the implementation of RTE has brought about almost nothing in the country. That's where our challenge begins. The entire, the quality of school education. Yes, we have buildings. Yes, we have enrollment, sometimes more than 100%. But the real problem is there is no attention to quality of education, and unfortunately there is no way to even begin to measure whether children actually learn anything inside the school.
Okay, I'm going to bring in Mr. Doval because he, of course, has a conference here. I'm going to bring in Mr. Doval from Goa. But Mr. Doval, also when we talk about these issues, Mr. Yadav, Professor Yadav referred to RT, but when we talk about schemes like Manrega, when we talk about the PDS system, the argument that the new India or the young India which has voted in Mr. Modi and the new government in such overwhelming numbers is looking for change, but are we sometimes being too hasty in throwing out the baby with the bathwater? That are we looking at perhaps just repackaging? We're not looking at outcomes. We're not looking at actual efficacy of actual implementation. We're just renaming schemes. One is Swachh Bharat. The UPA will say, oh, we had this scheme. It's all the same old schemes under different names, and what's happening on the ground is not changing.
Nirmal Bharat earlier.
Swachh Bharat, for instance, I mean, that was really a flagship scheme, but on the ground implementation is still way behind. As an observer of what's currently happening, do you think that there is perhaps some blurring of goals, perhaps because of the political churn we're seeing in Parliament?
No, I disagree with you, Sonia. I think in terms of aspirations of what India wants, I think people have, it's very evident and it's very clear. I mean, you have to be blind, or you don't have to, you are not sensitized enough if you can't see it. I think the challenge that lies is that the tools and instrumentalities, including the state apparatus that we have, does not have the architecture to deliver on those aspirations. We actually have an architectural problem that effectively the tools that are available have become so blunt that while the aspirations have moved into the 21st century for Indians, the method and methodologies by which we are trying to meet those aspirations are still probably stuck in the 19th or the 20th century. And that is a big mismatch. And I think that is what, if the new government should be looking to do, and I think that's what the Prime Minister is trying to do when he tries to link those new aspirations by newer methods of solving those, because this is also clearly established, as speaker after speaker has said, that the same instruments are not going to work. They haven't worked in the past. So when he talks about the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, now that if that means involving communities, you can't rely just on the municipality or the health department, or you've got to bring about attitudinal changes. If you've got to, that's what progressive and modern societies everywhere else in the world have done in tackling social issues. Social issues are just not the responsibility of the government. We've got to take it out from the state and bring it back into the communities. So I think that's really where the challenge will lie as we look into the 2015, is that while our aspirations are galloping as a nation, and rightly so, we are not building capacities and capabilities in a commensurate manner to meet them. And I think that's really, in my view, the challenge of this government, or it would be the challenge of any government. And that's why I think the last government also in some senses failed, because they just could not, the gap between the aspirations and their delivery became so wide.